The fluorescent hum of a small hotel lobby at 3 a.m. has a specific medicinal frequency. It is the sound of absolute isolation. For most, the world is a series of dreams. But for those of us behind the laminate counters of three-story motels or roadside gas stations, the world is a claustrophobic box of artificial light surrounded by an infinite, devouring ink. I used to find comfort in that isolation. I am the kind of person who prefers the company of shadows and paperwork to the exhausting friction of a midday crowd. But a year ago, that comfort was dismantled, replaced by a lingering, visceral sickness that settles in my gut every time the sun begins to dip below the horizon. The hotel was a modest, 3-floor operation, 40 rooms total, though on a Tuesday night in the dead of winter, only 10 or 15 held sleeping souls. I worked the 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. stretch. My sanctuary was a cramped office tucked behind the front desk, shielded by a thick pane of glass that allowed me to survey the lobby like a sentry. The lobby itself was a study in beige. A few sagging couches, a television that remained perpetually dark after midnight, and a row of vending machines that groaned and clicked in the stillness. At night, the front doors were magnetic deadbolts. No one entered without my permission. I was the gatekeeper of this small, silent kingdom. At 11 p.m., the buzzer rasped through the quiet. I looked up from a stack of invoices to see a man standing on the other side of the glass. He was in his mid-40s, tall and sinewy, wearing the universal uniform of the nondescript. Faded jeans, a baseball cap pulled low, and a weathered backpack slung over one shoulder. There was nothing inherently predatory about his silhouette, yet as I pressed the button to release the lock, a cold draft seemed to follow him inside. "Do you have a room for the night?" His voice was dry, sandpaper on wood. "Yes, sir. $85 plus tax." I replied, my fingers already dancing across the keyboard. He nodded, a sharp, bird-like movement, and produced a credit card. I took it, the plastic cold against my skin. I swiped it through the terminal. The machine emitted its standard, cheerful beep of success. I programmed a key card for room 214 and slid it across the counter. Then, the silence stretched. He didn't pick up the key immediately. Instead, he stood there, his body perfectly still, staring at me. His eyes were a flat, unreadable gray. He didn't blink. Four long seconds. The kind of seconds where you can hear your own heart thudding against your ribs. He simply studied my face. Then, without a word of thanks, he took the card and retreated toward the elevators. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Just a tired traveler, I told myself. Asterisk socially awkward. Maybe nothing more. Asterisk. An hour passed. The lobby remained a tomb. Around midnight, I glanced through the glass partition and felt my stomach perform a slow, sickening roll. The man was back. He hadn't come from the elevators. He seemed to have simply materialized in the lounge. He was sitting on one of the far couches, positioned directly in front of the television. The screen was off, a vast black mirror reflecting nothing but the dim emergency lights. He didn't have a phone out. He wasn't reading. He was simply sitting, his back straight, staring into the void of the blank screen. I tried to ignore him. I focused on YouTube, the bright colors of the videos a desperate distraction. But every time the audio dipped, I could feel the weight of his presence through the glass. After 30 minutes, curiosity, or perhaps a mounting sense of dread, pushed me out of the office. I needed water. As I crossed the lobby toward the vending machine, the floorboards seemed to scream under my weight. I didn't look at him, but I felt his head track my movement. It was a slow, mechanical pivot. I could feel his gaze crawling up my spine, lingering on the back of my neck. I bought my water, the clatter of the bottle hitting the tray, sounding like a gunshot in the silence, and retreated to my glass cage. At 1 a.m., the boredom turned into an investigation. I opened the occupied room list on the computer. Room 214, vacant. I frowned, a chill prickling my scalp. I refreshed the screen. Vacant. I pulled up the transaction logs for the entire shift. There was no record of a check-in for 214. No name. No credit card authorization. My mind raced. I had held the card. I had heard the beep. Yet, the system was a clean slate, as if the last 10 minutes of our interaction had been a hallucination. I picked up the desk phone and dialed 214. I pressed the receiver to my ear, listening to the rhythmic, lonely pulse of the ring. 5 times. 8. 10. No answer. Finally, I checked the electronic key log. This was the definitive proof. The log recorded every time a magnetic strip touched a door lock in the building. Room 214 had not been opened. Not once. He had never gone to the room. I looked through the glass. He was still there, a statue in a baseball cap, staring at the black television. The air in the office felt suddenly thin. My lungs burned as I tried to breathe normally. I waited 15 minutes, my hands trembling as I gripped the edge of the desk, before I forced myself to walk out there. "Sir, is everything okay?" My voice sounded thin and fragile. He turned his head. His expression remained a terrifying blank slate. "I just can't sleep," he said. The words were hollow, devoid of any human inflection. "I understand," I stammered. "If you need anything..." He didn't respond. He simply turned back to the blank screen. By 2 a.m., he was gone from the couch. My relief lasted only a heartbeat before I realized I hadn't heard the elevator or the front door. I scanned the darkness of the lobby. There, at the far end of the hallway leading to the public restrooms, I saw a sliver of his jeans. He was standing in the shadows, half hidden, watching the desk. I called my manager, my voice a frantic whisper. She was groggy, her judgment clouded by sleep. "Just keep an eye on him," she sighed. "Call the cops if he gets aggressive. He doesn't have to be aggressive to be a threat," I thought as I hung up. I switched to the security feed. I watched him on the first floor hallway camera. He walked to the very end of the corridor, stood motionless for several minutes facing a blank wall, and then retreated. Later, he entered the stairwell. He stayed in that concrete tomb for 10 minutes. I couldn't see what he was doing. I could only imagine him standing in the dark, listening to the building breathe. By 3:30 a.m., the psychological pressure snapped. I called a non-emergency line. "There's a man here," I told the dispatcher. "He isn't a guest. He's just wandering, watching." As I waited, he moved again. He was no longer hiding. He stood 15 feet from the desk, squarely in the light, staring at me. He didn't blink. He stood with the terrifying patience of a predator outside a glass enclosure. At 3:50, the buzzer rang. My heart leapt. Asterisk the police? Asterisk no. It was a late-arriving guest. I let him in, and I watched the man's eyes lock onto the newcomer. He studied the guest with a clinical intensity, his gaze following the man all the way to the elevator. It wasn't curiosity. It was a harvest of information. The man vanished again. I flicked through the camera feeds, my breath hitching. I found him on the first floor. He was standing directly outside a guest's door. He wasn't knocking. He wasn't trying to handle. He was just leaning in, his ear inches from the wood, listening to the person sleeping inside. I dialed 911. "He's at a guest's door. Please." Now, for 3 minutes, I watched him haunt that doorway. Then, as if sensing the approaching sirens, he walked back to the lobby. He didn't sit down. He walked right up to the desk, no glass between us this time, and leaned over the counter. His face was inches from mine. "Is there any food?" he whispered. His breath smelled of nothing. No coffee, no mint, just stale air. Vending machines. In the corner, I managed to choke out. He gave a small, jagged smile. It was the first time his expression had changed, and it was worse than the blankness. Then he walked away. When the police arrived at 4:10, they found him back on the couch, staring at the dead TV. They questioned him, their voices a low murmur. They let him out in handcuffs. One officer returned to the desk to finish the report. "The card he gave you? Stolen," the officer said, flipping through his notebook. "No ID, no lagi, no reservation. He wasn't trying to stay here. He was just trying to get inside." I spent the rest of my shift in a state of catatonic shock. The realization was a poison. He had been in my space for 5 hours. He had been standing in the dark, watching me, listening to guests, recording our movements. He had no plan that involved sleep. He had a plan that involved us. My name is Meredith. I'm 24, and I thought I'd found safety in the mundane. I worked the night shift at a tiny gas station off County Road 11, a place defined by the smell of diesel and the lonely whistle of wind across the plains. It began on a Thursday, 1 a.m. The air was thick with a pre-storm humidity that made the overhead lights buzz with a manic energy. I was alone, reaching for a stale cinnamon roll to break the monotony when the door chimed. A man entered. He was in his mid-40s, wearing a heavy green coat despite the damp heat. His hair was a chaotic nest, and his lips were dry, cracked into a permanent grimace. He didn't look at the coffee. He didn't look at the snacks. He walked to the counter and just looked at me. "Hi," I said, my professional mask slipping into place. "You always work this late," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with a terrifying familiarity. Yeah, mostly," I replied, my skin beginning to crawl. I figured, he smiled, a slow, predatory unfolding of his face. "I've passed through a few times. Noticed it's always you." "Small town," I said, trying to dismiss the intimacy of his observation. He didn't move. "Meredith, right?" I froze. My hand went to my chest, searching for a name tag that wasn't there. I hadn't worn one in months. "How do you know my name?" He gestured vaguely toward the whiteboard near the coffee station. "You have nice handwriting. Cinnamon coffee is back." Most people dot their I's like circles. You use little slashes. It's very specific. Thoughtful. I couldn't speak. I watched him stand there for another minute, his eyes tracing the contours of my face as if he were memorizing a map. Then, with a polite nod, he vanished into the fog. He became a ghost that refused to leave. He showed up at 2 a.m. on Tuesdays, 4 a.m. on Fridays. Sometimes he would come inside to buy a single bottle of water, lingering at the counter to comment on my mood. "You're quieter tonight," he'd say, or "You look tired." Other nights, he wouldn't come in at all. I would look out into the darkness of a lot and see his car, engine off, headlights dark, parked at the very edge of the property. Just a silhouette behind a windshield, watching. One night, the air in the store felt particularly heavy. He leaned on the counter, his eyes roaming the aisles. "It must get lonely," he mused. "Just you out here in the dark. No one for miles." "I'm fine," I snapped, stepping back toward the office door. "You always keep the back room locked," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Smart. I noticed you check the handle around 2 a.m. almost every night." The floor seemed to tilt. He knew my routine. He knew my habits. He was documenting the seconds of my life. The breaking point came a week later. I returned from a brief break to find a Polaroid sitting on the counter. It was a photo of me from behind, taken days ago while I was refilling the windshield washer bin. It was a close-up. I could see the individual strands of my hair. On the bin, the word windshield was visible, though I had been circled in red ink, highlighting the slash that he was so obsessed with. When he next walked through the door, I didn't greet him. I held my phone visible on the counter. "Leave. Now. I'm calling the police." "Paul," that was the name he had given me, just nodded. "I get it. I've been too forward. You've been following me." I screamed, my voice cracking with a terrifying fragility. "I just think you're the kind of person who's used to being misunderstood," he said, his voice calm, almost parental. "I thought you'd appreciate someone who pays attention." "That's not paying attention. That's obsession." He didn't flinch. "Would it be easier if I wore a smile? Would I be more normal if I pretended I didn't notice the way your shoes are half size too big? Or how your left eyelid twitches when you're exhausted?" The police arrived while he was still speaking. They found his car was a mobile shrine to my existence. A notepad filled with my schedule, descriptions of my clothes, the brands of groceries I carried to my car. One page was just my name, written hundreds of times, the loops of the M getting tighter and more frantic until the ink tore through the paper. I moved 2 hours away. I don't work nights. But sometimes when I'm driving home and a pair of headlights stays behind me for 1 mile too many, I can still hear his voice. I can still feel him paying attention. The fear doesn't always come in a single person. Sometimes it's a presence, a collective weight that settles over a parking lot like a shroud. I'm 22, and I've only been at the 24-hour station for 2 months. It's a weekend shift, Thursday through Saturday. Last night, the air felt electric, charged with a tension I couldn't name. At 2:30 a.m., my coworker Max and his friend Ben swung by. They were in the middle of a psychedelic trip, giggling and wide-eyed, finding humor in the patterns of the floor tiles. Their levity was a welcome break from the silence, until Ben looked out the window. "Hey," Ben said, his voice dropping. "That car is still there." He pointed to a vehicle parked in the far corner of the lot. It was running, its exhaust a faint plume in the cold air, but its lights were completely dark. "The guy told me he was waiting for a DoorDash order," Ben added. I frowned. I hadn't seen a DoorDash notification in over 2 hours. I usually spend my nights cleaning the back, far from the windows. I was a sitting duck in a bright box, unaware of the wolf at the edge of the light. An hour later, Max and Ben came back in for more coffee. Their trip was mellowing into a sharp, paranoid clarity. "He's still out there," Max whispered. "He's been there for an hour. He just sits there, texting, then looking at the door, then back to his phone." Ben, fueled by a surge of drug-induced bravado, had approached the car earlier. "What's up? Why are you watching us?" he had asked. The driver had first tried to pretend he didn't speak English. When Ben didn't leave, the man suddenly found his English. "Wrong address," he muttered before peeling out of the lot. But there was more. Max, a car enthusiast even when high, noticed the details. The car was brand new, a Subaru, but it had no license plates. And in the back seat, a mountain of heavy blankets, arranged in a way that could easily conceal a person. Even more chilling. As the Subaru fled, a second car, also brand new, also plateless, pulled out from a different dark corner of the lot and followed it in perfect formation. A silent, coordinated fleet. I worked the next night with a knife clipped to my pocket and my heart in my throat. At 3 a.m., a group of 4 men came in for snacks. "You know about that Subaru at the end of the lot?" One of them asked as I rang up his coffee. My blood turned to ice. "The one with no plates?" "Yeah," he said, glancing back over his shoulder. 2 guys in the front. They were arguing, pointing at the store doors. When they saw us looking, they backed out and hit the road. I realized then that my paranoia wasn't a symptom of the night. It was a survival instinct. These cars didn't park where I could see them from the register. They stayed in the blind spots. They waited for the moment the lot was empty, for the moment the protection of other customers vanished. I don't work for the next few days. I spend my time in a locked apartment, wondering how many times the silent fleet has watched me change the trash under the humming gas station lights, waiting for the one night I'm truly alone. My name is Daniel, and I know the sound of Motel's bones. At 29, I worked the overnight shift at a rural, family-owned motel. 25 rooms of flickering light and wood rot. The office is a small front room, but the back office is where I spend my life. It's a lounge with a couch and a TV. There's a speaker back there that dings when someone hits the bell at the front desk. It's a simple system. On a Tuesday in October, the air was bitter. The parking lot held only 5 cars, their surfaces frosted with a thin layer of ice. At 2 a.m., the bell rang. Ding! I stood up, stretched, and walked into the front lobby. Empty. I looked out the glass doors. The road was a ribbon of black. No headlights. No footprints in the frost. I shrugged it off as a mechanical glitch and went back to my couch. 10 minutes later, ding. This time I ran. I burst into the lobby, my heart hammering. Again, emptiness. The silence was absolute. I went outside, my breath blooming in the cold air. I walked the perimeter of the building. Nothing. I decided to sit behind the desk. If it was a prank, a guest kid, or a local drunk, I would catch them. I dimmed the lights, becoming a shadow among shadows. The clock on the wall ticked with the weight of a sledgehammer. Asterisk tick. 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 Asterisk. 20 minutes of agonizing silence passed. I felt my eyelids drooping, the rhythmic clicking of the office fridge lulling me into a false sense of security. Then the bell rang. I didn't just hear it. I saw it. From a narrow gap beneath the front desk. A space I thought was too small for a human. A pale, bloodless hand reached up. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace. The fingers were long, the skin stretched tight over the knuckles. It pressed the bell directly in front of my face. I didn't scream. My voice died in my throat. I bolted. I scrambled down the hallway into the back office, slammed the door, and threw the bolt. I stood in the dark, my breath coming in jagged gasps. He had been there, the entire time, While I sat behind the desk, he was curled in the dark at my feet, inches from my legs. I turned to the security monitors. In the grainy, night vision glow of the lobby camera, I saw the chair I had vacated. It was overturned. Then, a head emerged from beneath the desk. The man didn't look away. He looked directly into the camera lens. His eyes caught the infrared light, glowing like a cat's. He crawled out on all fours, a grotesque, insect-like movement before standing up. He was tall, hunched, wearing a dark hoodie pulled so tight his face was a mere suggestion of features. He began to pace. He walked to the glass doors and stared out at the empty road, as if waiting for a signal. Then, he turned toward the hallway. The doorknob to my office rattled. It wasn't a violent shake. It was a slow, experimental turn. He was checking the strength of the lock. He stood there, pressed against the wood, and I knew he was listening to the sound of my terror. The police arrived minutes later. They found a rock propping the side door open, but the man was gone. He had slipped into the woods the moment the first blue light flickered on the horizon. I still work the night shift, but I never sit behind that desk. And every time a guest rings that bell, I don't see a traveler in need of a room. I see that pale, searching hand reaching up from the dark to announce its presence.